chaos of war, an unlikely hero takes flight. Bluebell, a simple carrier pigeon, bears a message that could alter the fate of thousands. Battling storms, predators, and enemy fire, she races against time. But as she nears her goal, an unexpected betrayal threatens to derail everything. Can this tiny bird overcome impossible odds and deliver hope before it's too late? The future hangs by a feather in this tale of courage against all odds.
The soft cooing of pigeons filled the air as Captain James Howard entered the loft, his boots squeaking on the worn wooden floor. Among the flutter of wings, one bird stood out, Bluebell, her blue-gray feathers shimmering in the early morning light. The captain's weathered hand gently stroked her back, a rare smile crossing his face. "Ready for another day, old girl," he murmured, his voice a stark contrast to the distant rumble of artillery. Bluebell had been with the British Army for over a year now, her keen homing instinct making her one of their most reliable messengers. The loft, a hastily constructed wooden structure on the outskirts of a small French village, had become her home. It was a far cry from the peaceful farm where she had hatched, but the war spared no one, not even pigeons. Captain Howard carefully attached a small metal canister to Bluebell's leg, his fingers working with practiced efficiency. Inside was a message that could save lives, change the course of a battle, or bring news of victory or defeat. The responsibility weighed heavily on both man and bird. "Remember your training," Howard whispered, more to himself than to Bluebell. "Fly straight, fly fast." As he prepared to release her, a young private burst into the loft, his face pale with urgency. "Captain, enemy forces spotted advancing from the east." The captain's jaw tightened as he processed the news. He looked at Bluebell, knowing her mission had just become even more critical. With a gentle toss, he sent her into the air, her wings beating strongly as she rose above the chaos about to unfold below. Bluebell soared higher, her keen eyes taking in the familiar landscape now marred by the scars of war. Fields that once rippled with golden wheat were now pockmarked with shell craters, and forests stood as blackened, skeletal remnants of their former glory. As she banked towards her destination, a deafening explosion rocked the air. The pigeon loft she had just left erupted in a cloud of splinters and fetters. Disoriented by the blast, Bluebell wheeled in the sky, her instincts screaming at her to return to the safety of a destroyed home. But the weight on her leg reminded her of her duty. Through the chaos, she spotted another pigeon tumbling through the air, a similar canister attached to its leg. Without hesitation, Bluebell altered her course, swooping towards her feathered comrade. As she neared the other bird, Bluebell could see it was badly injured. In a daring mid-air maneuver, she managed to catch the falling message tube as it slipped from the dying pigeon's leg. Now burdened with two messages, Bluebell felt the weight of her responsibility double. She knew, somehow, that the fate of many men now rested on her wings. With renewed determination, Bluebell beat her wings against the smoke-filled air. Enemy planes roared overhead, their bullets stitching deadly patterns across the sky. Anti-aircraft fire bloomed around her like deadly flowers. Through it all, Bluebell flew on, her path now uncertain but her purpose clearer than ever. She had to deliver these messages, no matter the cost. From her lofty vantage point, Bluebell surveyed the horrifying expanse of no man's land stretched out below. What had once been a patchwork of peaceful fields and quaint villages was now a hellish landscape of mud, barbed wire, and death. Trenches scarred the earth like open wounds. zigzagging across the terrain in a deadly maze. The acrid smell of cordite and decay rose on thermals, assaulting Bluebell's sensitive nostrils. Despite the danger, Bluebell dipped lower, searching for landmarks to guide her way. A shattered church spire, its cross still defiantly pointing skyward, caught her eye. She remembered this place from previous missions. It meant she was on the right track. As she banked around the ruined structure, a glint of metal in the sun caught her attention. Too late, she realized it was the barrel of a rifle, aimed directly at her. The sound of gunfire crackled through the air, and Bluebell felt a searing pain in her left wing. Feathers flew as the bullet grazed her, sending her into a spiraling descent. Fighting against the pain and encroaching panic, Bluebell managed to regain control, her wings straining as she pulled out of the dive mere meters above the cratered ground. She could hear shouts in German from below, followed by more gunfire. With her injury slowing her down, Bluebell knew she couldn't stay in the open. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for shelter. A partially collapsed farmhouse loomed ahead, its roof mostly intact. With the last of her strength, Bluebell aimed for a small hole in the tiles. She squeezed through the gap, tumbling onto the dusty attic floor in a flurry of feathers and exhaustion. As the sounds of battle raged outside, Bluebell huddled in the shadows. Her mission temporarily halted, but far from abandoned. Private Thomas Reed huddled in the muddy trench, his young face etched with lines of fatigue and fear. The acrid smell of gunpowder clung to his uniform as he peered over the sandbags. Scanning the desolate no-man's land, his units had been pinned down for days. Cut off from the main Allied forces and running dangerously low on supplies. The constant barrage of artillery had frayed their nerves to breaking point. Any sign of that blasted bird? Sergeant Wilkins growled, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle. Reed shook his head, trying to hide his disappointment. They had been promised vital intelligence to be delivered by one of the army's messenger pigeons. Without it, they were flying blind, easy prey for the enemy forces they knew were massing for an attack. Reed's thoughts drifted to the pigeons he'd seen at the command post. He'd marveled at their sleek forms and bright, intelligent eyes. At the time, he'd scoffed at the idea of entrusting crucial information to mere birds. Now, as he listened to the ominous rumble of approaching tanks, he found himself praying for the sight of wings on the horizon. A sudden commotion at the far end of the trench caught Reed's attention. He scrambled towards the noise, hope rising in his chest. Had the messenger finally arrived? As he rounded a bend in the trench, his heart sank. It wasn't a pigeon bringing salvation, but a wounded soldier being carried in. His legs, a mangled mess from a mortar blast. Reed turned away, bile rising in his throat. They needed that message, and they needed it soon. Bluebell's rest in the farmhouse attic was short-lived. The pain in her wing had dulled to a persistent throb, and she knew she couldn't delay her mission any longer. With cautious movements, she hopped to the edge of the hole in the roof, her keen eyes scanning the sky. The air was thick with an unfamiliar, acrid mist, a new type of gas the humans had devised to make the war even more hellish. Steeling herself, Bluebell launched into the noxious air. Almost immediately, she felt its effects. Her eyes stung, and her usual impeccable sense of direction wavered. She wheeled in confusion, struggling to find her bearings in the poisonous haze. The messages, still securely fastened to her legs, seemed to grow heavier with each labored wing beat. Below, the earth was a maze of trenches and barbed wire, punctuated by the staccato flashes of gunfire. Bluebell's training urged her to fly high, to avoid the dangers below, but the gas forced her to stay low, skimming just above the devastated landscape. She darted between plumes of smoke and showers of dirt thrown up by exploding shells, her heart pounding with a mix of terror and determination. As she flew, Bluebell caught glimpses of the humans below. Some pointed up at her, their faces a mix of hope and desperation. Others raised their rifles, seeing only a target. A bullet whizzed past her head, so close she felt the rush of air. With a surge of speed born of fear, Bluebell pushed on, knowing that somewhere ahead, humans were waiting for the messages she carried. Messages that might finally bring an end to this madness. Sergeant Wilhelm Kruger lowered his binoculars, a frown creasing his weathered face. From his vantage point in the German trench, he had a clear view of the enemy lines. But it wasn't the Allied soldiers that concerned him at the moment. It was the skies above them. "Anything?" asked the young corporal beside him, nervously adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Patience," Schmidt-Kruger growled, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "The British are desperate. They'll send their little feathered spies soon enough." As if on cue, a distant speck appeared in the sky, growing larger as it approached. Kruger allowed himself a grim smile. There. Right on schedule. Kruger had earned a reputation as the best pigeon shooter in the regiment. It was a skill he took no pleasure in, but war had a way of twisting men's talents to its own cruel purposes. He raised his specially modified rifle, peering through the scope. The approaching bird was flying erratically, lower than usual. Easy prey. As Kruger's finger tightened on the trigger, a memory flashed unbidden through his mind. His daughter's pet dove, left behind when they fled their home. With a curse, he shook off the moment of weakness. This was war, and that pigeon carried information that could cost German lives. Taking a deep breath, he steadied his aim and squeezed the trigger. "Certainly, I'll continue with the next 3 chapters of our story, maintaining the same structure and guidelines." Bluebell's wings burned with exhaustion as she pushed through the thinning gas cloud. Suddenly, an odd sensation prickled through her feathers, a feeling she'd experienced before, but never understood. Without thinking, she banked sharply to the left. A split second later, a resounding boom shook the air where she had just been flying. Shrapnel whistled past, missing her by inches. Down in the trenches, Private Reed stared in awe at the tiny bird navigating the barrage with uncanny precision. "Did you see that?" he shouted to Sergeant Wilkins over the din. "That pigeon, it's like it knew the shell was coming." Wilkins squinted at the sky, his skepticism warring with hope. "If that bird's carrying our intel, it better get here fast," he grunted. Back at the command post, Captain Howard paced anxiously. Hours had passed since he'd sent Bluebell on her mission, far longer than usual. He'd seen her dodge artillery before, a skill that had made her their most valuable messenger. But this time, something was different. The enemy had stepped up their efforts to intercept messages. Howard couldn't shake the feeling that he'd sent Bluebell on a suicide mission. As if sensing her handler's distress, Bluebell redoubled her efforts. Her mysterious new sense tingled again, and she dived just as another shell exploded overhead. With each evasion, her confidence grew. She was no longer just a carrier of messages, but an active player in this great and terrible game. Through smoke and fire, Bluebell flew on, her path now guided by more than just training and instinct. As Bluebell neared the Allied trenches, a new threat emerged. A hawk, drawn by the chaos of battle, spotted the exhausted pigeon and began to dive. Bluebell's keen eyes spotted the predator, but her tired wings couldn't muster the speed to outfly it. Just as the hawk's talons were about to close around her, a blur of feathers intercepted the attack. A flock of starlings, disturbed from their roost by the constant shelling, had taken to the air. Seeing Bluebell's plight, they mobbed the hawk, their sheer numbers confusing and deterring the larger bird. Bluebell watched in amazement as her unexpected allies drove off the predator. Their aerial acrobatics, a dance of survival amidst the war-torn sky. Seizing the opportunity, Bluebell fell in with the flock. The starlings seemed to sense her urgency, adjusting their flight to accommodate her injured wing. Together, they navigated the perilous airspace, the smaller bird's rapid movements making it difficult for enemy shooters to draw a bead on Bluebell. For a moment, the horror of war faded, replaced by the simple beauty of birds in flight. As they approached the Allied lines, the starlings peeled away, their mission accomplished. Bluebell cooed a soft thanks, knowing they couldn't understand, but feeling the gratitude nonetheless. She could see figures moving in the trenches below, hands pointing up at her in excitement. With a final burst of speed, Bluebell began her descent. The weight of her messages a reminder of the vital task she still had to complete. Private Reed's heart leapt as he saw the pigeons spiraling down towards their trench. "She made it," he cried, scrambling to alert the others. But as Bluebell neared the ground, a gaunt figure lunged forward, hands outstretched not in welcome, but with desperate, grasping fingers. It was Jenkins, a soldier driven to the brink by hunger and fear. "Give it here," Jenkins snarled, snatching at Bluebell. "We haven't eaten in days." Reed watched in horror as his comrade, a man he'd shared rations and stories with, now turned on their potential savior. Without thinking, Reed tackled Jenkins, both men tumbling into the mud. "Have you gone mad?" Reed shouted, struggling to restrain his friend. "That bird could save us all." Bluebell, startled by the sudden violence, fluttered just out of reach. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to return to the safety of her loft. But the memory of Captain Howard's gentle hands and the weight of the messages on her legs kept her close. She watched the struggling men with wary eyes, torn between duty and self-preservation. Sergeant Wilkins arrived, pulling the two soldiers apart. "Stand down, both of you," he roared. His stern gaze fell on Jenkins, who sagged in defeat, the madness fading from his eyes. Red, panting, turned to Bluebell, who still hovered nervously nearby. "It's all right," he cooed, mimicking the soothing tones he'd heard the handlers use. "You're safe now. Come on down, little one. Let's see what you've brought us." "Certainly. I'll continue with the next 3 chapters of our story, maintaining the same structure and guidelines." As Bluebell settled onto Reed's outstretched arm, a distant rumble of thunder echoed across the battlefield. Sergeant Wilkins carefully removed the message canisters from her legs, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the significance of what they held. "Get these to the captain immediately," he ordered, thrusting the tubes into Reed's free hand. Reed nodded, cradling Bluebell gently as he made his way through the winding trenches. Captain Howard's face lit up with relief as Reed entered the command dugout. "Bluebell," he exclaimed, reaching for the exhausted bird. As he examined her injuries, his expression darkened. "She's been through hell to bring us these," he muttered, carefully placing her in a makeshift nest. Howard turned his attention to the messages, his brow furrowing as he decoded their contents. The atmosphere in the dugout grew tense as Howard shared the intelligence. The enemy was planning a massive offensive, timed to coincide with an approaching storm. "If this information is correct," Howard said gravely, "we have less than 24 hours to prepare our defenses and warn headquarters." He looked at Bluebell, who was already beginning to recover under his care. "And I'm afraid we'll need to ask one more service of our brave messenger." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Bluebell ruffled her feathers and stood taller in her nest. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant echoes of enemy movement. The storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, and Bluebell would soon be flying into the heart of it. The sky was an ominous gray as Captain Howard prepared Bluebell for her most perilous flight yet. "This message must reach headquarters," he told her softly, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping she sensed their importance. With gentle hands, he attached the vital intelligence to her leg. "Godspeed, little one," he whispered, releasing her into the turbulent air. Bluebell's wings beat furiously against the strengthening wind as she gained altitude. The storm clouds loomed before her, dark and forbidding. As she entered their midst, the world became a chaos of swirling mists and sudden, disorienting flashes of lightning. Rain pelted her feathers, each droplet feeling like a tiny bullet against her small body. Still, she flew on, driven by an instinct deeper than fear. In the heart of the storm, Bluebell lost all sense of direction. The magnetic fields that usually guided her were scrambled by the electrical charges in the air. She wheeled blindly, buffeted by gusts that threatened to dash her against the ground. A particularly violent gust caught her off guard, sending her tumbling through the air. For a heart-stopping moment, Bluebell plummeted, her wings failing her. Just as all seemed lost, a flash of lightning illuminated a familiar landmark far below. The shattered spire of the church she had passed days before. With a supreme effort, Bluebell righted herself, her wings straining as she fought against exhaustion and the elements. The message on her leg seemed to burn with urgency, giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. Through thunder and lightning, Bluebell flew on, a tiny speck of determination in the face of nature's fury. The guards at Allied headquarters squinted into the storm, their faces etched with concern. They had been warned to expect a messenger, but in this weather, it seemed an impossible task. Suddenly, a small shape emerged from the gloom, more falling than flying. "There!" shouted one of the guards, rushing forward to catch the plummeting bird. Bluebell felt gentle hands close around her as she finally lost her battle with consciousness. She had no way of knowing that her arrival had been just in time. Within minutes, the message was in the hands of the commanding general, its contents spurring a flurry of activity throughout the base. Orders were dispatched, reinforcements mobilized, all based on the intelligence this tiny, bedraggled bird had brought through the storm. As medics tended to the wounded soldiers in the infirmary, a young veterinarian worked tirelessly to save Bluebell's life. Her wing, already injured from the earlier gunshot, had been further damaged by the brutal flight. "Come on, little hero," the vet murmured, carefully wrapping the wing. "You've done your part. Now it's time to rest and heal." Miles away, on the front lines, Captain Howard and his men waited tensely for the enemy attack they now knew was coming. Thanks to Bluebell's bravery, they were prepared. As the storm began to clear and the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the sound of approaching tanks rumbled in the distance. The men gripped their weapons, ready to face whatever came. And in each of their hearts was a silent prayer of thanks for a small, brave bird that had given them a fighting chance. Certainly. I'll continue with the next 3 chapters of our story, maintaining the same structure and guidelines. The earth shook as enemy tanks rolled across no man's land, their engines growling like hungry beasts. Private Reed crouched in the trench, his fingers white-knuckled around his rifle. But unlike before, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Thanks to Bluebell's warning, they were ready. Hidden anti-tank guns hastily moved into position during the night, waited silently for their prey. Captain Howard stood at the command post, his face grim but determined. He raised his binoculars, scanning the approaching force. "Steady, lads," he murmured, though only the wind could hear him. The tanks were now halfway across the field, exactly where the intelligence had predicted they would be. Howard took a deep breath and gave the signal. The world erupted into chaos. Anti-tank rounds screamed across the battlefield, finding their marks with devastating accuracy. Caught off guard, the enemy advance faltered. From his vantage point in the German lines, Sergeant Kruger watched in disbelief as his side's surprise attack crumbled. "Impossible," he muttered, realizing with a sinking feeling that somehow their plans had been leaked. As the battle raged, the tide slowly but surely turned in favor of the Allies. Private Reed found himself advancing across the very ground he had been defending, pushing the enemy back. In the heat of combat, his thoughts briefly flitted to Bluebell. Had she survived her perilous flight? He said a silent prayer of thanks for the brave little bird as he charged forward, determined to make her sacrifice count. Weeks after the battle, Bluebell perched on Captain Howard's arm, her injured wing finally healed. The camp buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for a special ceremony. "You've no idea what you've done, old girl," Howard said softly, stroking her feathers. Bluebell cooed contentedly, simply happy to be back with her human friend. General Haig himself had come to present medals of valor, an unusual honor for this small segment of the front. As he pinned medals on the chests of Captain Howard and Private Reed, he paused, looking at Bluebell. "And let us not forget," he announced, his voice carrying across the assembled troops, the smallest soldier among us, whose courage turned the tide of battle. A hush fell over the crowd as the general carefully fastened a tiny, specially made medal to Bluebell's leg band. The absurdity of the moment. A pigeon receiving a military honor was not lost on the men. Yet not a single snicker or jeer was heard. Every soldier there knew that without this bird's bravery, many of them would not be standing there today. As the ceremony concluded, Private Reed approached Captain Howard and Bluebell. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "I was wondering, what will happen to her now?" Howard smiled, looking at the pigeon on his arm. "Well, Private, I think Bluebell here has earned her retirement. When this war is over, I plan to take her home with me. She'll have a comfortable coop and never have to fly through gunfire again." Years after the war's end, Captain Howard, now a schoolteacher, stood before a class of wide-eyed children. On his shoulder sat Bluebell, her feathers grayed but her eyes still bright. "And that, children," he concluded, "is the story of how a pigeon helped win the war." The students clapped and cheered, some reaching out to gently pet Bluebell's feathers. As the children filed out for recess, a small girl lingered. "Mr. Howard," she asked shyly, "do you think animals know when they're being brave?" Howard considered the question, looking at Bluebell thoughtfully. "I think, my dear, that bravery isn't about knowing. It's about doing what's right, even when you're afraid." Bluebell here didn't know she was being brave. She was just doing what she was trained to do, what she knew was important. That night, as Howard prepared Bluebell's evening feed, he reflected on the legacy of the war. The world had changed, but the lessons remained. Courage, loyalty, and compassion knew no bounds. Not of nation, not of species, Bluebell had taught him that. As if sensing his thoughts, the old pigeon cooed softly, nuzzling his hand. In the years that followed, Bluebell's story spread far and wide. It inspired a new generation to look at animals differently, to recognize their capacity for heroism and their role in human history. And in military bases around the world, a new respect emerged for the animal companions that served alongside human soldiers. Bluebell's legacy lived on, a testament to the extraordinary impact one small creature could have on the course of human events.